Hello, everybody, and happy Friday. Thank you for joining us here on right here for the Labor Day weekend. So, for those that don't know, my name is John Winston. I am the host for these Apex trainings, so your lead trainer, as well as I am the director of state and local political programs here at NAR. And we're going to have a little bit of a different Apex training, the webinar today. It is just me. So to tell you a little bit about my background before I joined NAR, I spent a number of years as a political consultant and as a campaign manager. And so I wanted to develop this particular training, to have a discussion about things I've learned as a political consultant, and also from sort of observing campaigns and working on a variety of campaigns at NAR on both the IE front and the issue advocacy front, where I do a lot of work with issue mobilization. For those that are new to this, I will tell you that if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, and I will try to answer them at the end of the session. Hopefully, we'll go through this rather quickly and succinctly today, because I know everybody's looking forward to hopefully getting to their Labor Day weekend activities. So again, what we're going to be talking about today is developing winning messages and creating better advocacy material to help you sort of get your message to break through. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges, sort of what's sort of the environment, what are things we have to sort of weigh in our consideration when we're thinking about deciding on what is our message, what are we trying to communicate to the different audiences that we may have, whether it is for an issue advocacy campaign where we're trying to pass or defeat legislation, whether it's a ballot initiative where we're trying to defeat or support a ballot initiative, or whether it's a support of a candidate campaign. And in the NAR world, that obviously comes in a lot of independent expenditure campaigns, right? You're not running the campaign, so you have a slightly different role in your messaging than you would if you have a candidate. So we're going to try and cover that. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of, first, like I said, lay out the sort of challenges we face. Second, we sort of talk about how we sort of unpack that, create winning messages. And then finally, we're going to end with a little bit about best practices on like when you develop the materials and how do you sort of express and show the best way to sort of communicate those messages. So here we go. Let's start. The first rule of the road is we have to know what's the audience we're communicating to, right? I think this is often unobserved. We sort of forget that we're not talking to people necessarily as informed as ourselves. It's a classic mistake. Often we think people are at the same education level, same basis of knowledge. One of my watchwords is we can never assume knowledge by most of our audiences. But I like to put them in sort of three different buckets you see there on the screen. One is your insiders and super informed. And your role as a guide, you may be talking to insiders and super informed people, right? So legislators, people that know a lot about the issues, people that understand the acronyms that you use. But so that's one bucket, and we certainly should keep those in mind. And what I will also say, and some of the things I'll be talking about today, even with the super informed and the insiders, you want to keep some of these same tips and tactics also in mind as well. Just because they're super informed doesn't necessarily mean that they're not preoccupied and hard to break through with a strong message. Your second bucket there is your informed. These are your better educated voters, but they are not necessarily educated about the particular issue that you're advocating with, right? In realtor world, in what we do at NAR and in the realtor family, a lot of times the issues we deal with are not top of mind. They're not, they're sometimes complicated, like I said, usually have a lot of acronyms, et cetera. But so you have a group of voters out there, and potentially that are well educated and are up on issues and stay up on issues, but they don't necessarily understand or have even heard what is an ADU, right? That makes a lot of sense. And if you go to any NAR convention or whatever, we say word ADU all over again. My guess is even very educated people with master's degrees couldn't tell you what an ADU is or what it stands for, right? So I think that's something to keep in mind as we move forward. And then the other thing is your average voters, right? Your citizens who you may be trying to activate, that you're trying to reach, whether it's through an independent expenditure as voters or as citizens, if you're trying to get them to take action to support what you're trying to do, to try to reach out to the council members, and what I do a lot with issue mobilization. So those are the three couple buckets that you usually run into. There's some other ways to group this, but I wanted to go through that. Now, I think what's important and what I'd like to emphasize is that we often we are surrounded by people. The people we interact with, by and large, are college educated, many with master's degree, etc. Very informed people, are very versed in issues that we deal with, and that's who we talk to when we're doing lobbying. That is who we talk to when we're in our professional group settings. But what you have on the screen is, this is the U.S. literacy rate across it. And what I would argue is that over half of adult Americans read at a 8th or 7th grade level or lower. Right. And so sometimes I think it's very important when you're thinking about your messaging is you've got to put it in language that a 7th grader could understand. And one of the tests I always say is if you can't hand, so when I had my son's at college now, but when he was younger, if I couldn't hand him something and he didn't understand it, then it's probably not, like when he was in middle school, that's not comprehensible to the average voter. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind when we're writing these things, when we're using language and long sentences and so forth, is to really think through that a lot of times who we're reaching out to, right? If you're you're testifying in front of a committee, that's a different audience, right? But by and large, it's very natural when somebody asks you to write, hey, talking points, or to think through how do we communicate to folks. Your natural tendency is to write at the level that you read at, to write at your sort of comprehension level, the level that you are comfortable with, right? And you have to sometimes think through to keep it simple and keep it clear. So that's one of the points I want to raise today. Rule number 2. Who is your opposition, right? And I'm not necessarily talking about those that are opposing you, right? So a group that is trying to push, say, rent control. This isn't about them. Your opposition, by and large, both if you're trying to communicate to people that you're trying to move to vote for your candidate, or if you're trying to move them on an issue and inform them about an issue and getting activated, it's the distractions of everyday modern life, right? We see that gentleman over there on the left-hand screen, and that is all of us, right? We all have our phones close by, and we got all sorts of things going on, and that is your opposition, right? Because you are trying to say something important, whether it's to them as voters or whether it is to people as, you're trying to activate to get information to move them. And even with your super informed voters, right? They are distracted. You have something important to them to say. You're trying to get through to them, and how do you get into their space to get through that very important message, right? And so that, keep in mind that your biggest opponent is the distractions of everyday modern life. 3, the other thing is because people are distracted, and think about yourself. Let's be honest. Most people browse, like when you send an email, I guarantee a lot of times people don't read it fully, right? guilty as charged, right? A lot of times people aren't spending the time because we feel so harried in our natural life. And so what I like to say is we want to do the homework for our intended audience. We want the voters, we want the people we're trying to move to get it so instantly, right? And that's the real skill and the real challenge here. To get it so instantly, they don't have to like go look stuff up. They don't have to look up what the definition of the ADU is. They don't have to look up what excise tax is. Those are things that, like, how do you sort of put it in a plain enough language that people sort of get it intuitively and understand it, right? Because they're just not going to do the homework. You can put the QR codes on, and maybe they go to your website, and that is definitely a best practice. I'm arguing that you would do that. But as you think about what you want to say, don't put it in such a way that people have to sort of figure it out, to get out the dictionary to think through those things. And the other thing is sort of one of my watchwords is don't miss the forest for the trees. All right. And it's again, I'm using cliches, which can sometimes cloud language, but what I will say is that you don't want to give people so much information. And a classic mistake I see a lot, especially with candidates and indirect mail, which is what I used to do is write direct mail, is that there's all this space. And the natural inclination is to fill up that space with words. And you see a blank page and you want to fill in all this additional information. And I'm not saying that supporting material is not good, but sometimes when you give people too much, it's information overload. They can't see what you're trying to show them, right? They can't see the forest for the trees, right? They don't understand what you're doing. So you're by overcomplicating things. So that's sort of the challenges of your sort of communication environment, and a lot of things, whether it's life or whether it's in the advocacy world. All right, so let's dig a little bit deeper into this and talk about sort of what do people care about. And so when I do these candidate trainings, and when I work with candidates, we would do polling. And one of the things we always sort of said is, there's things you should keep in mind with is that when you're asking people for their vote, you're asking them to trust you if you're the candidate running for office, to represent them in the city council, on county council, in state legislature, in Congress, right? And they're looking for, what voters are looking for are people who share their values and cares about people like them, and that they can trust to represent those values and interests in whatever elected office they are. And a lot of what campaigning is, it's not about necessarily who's the most qualified for office. It's not necessarily about, like I said, somebody's resume. It's more instinctual. Do they like somebody? Do they seem like somebody, right? Now, shares your values is often code word for, same political party as you, right? So if I'm a Republican, they're a Republican, you could fill in that information. Cares about people like them. It shows that you think that they're going to stand up and represent those values when they're in that elected office. And why is that relevant? As you think about with your job, right? You're not a candidate running for office, but it's good to understand what are voters when you're talking electoral politics. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to get to with voters? So even when you're doing independent expenditures, how do you show that candidate that you're supporting, right? It's not about experience or what, it's like that they can be trusted to represent their values and interests on the state legislature. So when you think about what communication you want to do for any candidate you're supporting, even if it's an independent expenditure, and it's a little bit harder to do, at the independent expenditure level than it is from the candidate's perspective. But what you want to get to with voters is say, hey, you can trust John Winston to represent Alexander, to represent us. And it's not exactly those words, but maybe it's symbolic. Sometimes it's using issues to show we can trust John with our pocketbook because he's fit, he's a proven fiscal conservative or whatever that is. So I'll circle back to that. It's a little bit different though when you think about the audience when you're trying to, when you're not, it's not about asking people for their vote. This is when people, it's in some ways it's more challenging, right? Because with a vote, you're asking people to go in and cast a vote for your particular candidate. However, when you're asking people to actually take action, right, to support this, even among realtors, like even if you're just reaching out to your members, right, what they're looking for is they need to know how it impacts them. Number one, right? How is this relevant to my life? Remember, again, going back to our couple rules at the beginning, which is that people lead, our number one opposition is distractions of everyday modern life. All the things that are getting in the way between us and the audience that we're trying to communicate, right? Secondly, they have to understand your solution, right? At a very basic level, right? Third, they need to believe that their advocacy will make a difference. And then fourth, finally, is have a simple path to then take that action, right? So what are the barriers we're putting in? So when you get, and this is more to getting into communication tactics, right? So that can you have a QR code that goes straight to a web page that allows you to then, do a quick email to the legislator in person? Can you do like pass-through calls, which directly puts people in place? But first, let's talk about this. Know how it impacts them, right? So when you're thinking about how you sort of formulate your message, and you're thinking about that particular audience, you got to make sure that you're saying this will raise your taxes, this will do X to you, right? And then understand and make sure that they understand the solution. We need to vote this down because it will, right? So I'll talk a little bit more about this in just a second. And you also have to sort of give them credibility that their input, right? That they have to feel that if they can make a difference, that's when they're more likely to take action, right? So with advocacy messaging, it has to be clear, right? Because again, the challenges we're facing, it has to be concise. So it's like, again, concise, understandable, also compelling, right? So that they understand at some level that they have to do this, they need to do this. And then what I put down there is the bonus points if it touches what we call the responsive chord, if it's emotion. So if you think about it, anybody that has dealt with rent control, right? And so our opponents, the people on the other side, says, hey, rent control is driving people out of homes. It's an emotional appeal, right? Emotion drives people to action. If they feel like, if there's when there's been a disaster in a neighborhood, like it's happening in Florida and South Carolina, all these sorts of natural disasters, people naturally sort of have an emotional reaction to that. And I think a lot of times in what we do in the advocacy material I've seen and reviewed and looked at, we get a very technical, we get very cut and dried, and we forget to sort of tap into that emotional piece of how do we do this, right? So for example, if I was looking at rent control, right, and I've always thought of, like, with rent control, it's the wrong solution for the right problem, right? is even going saying less. We could actually, if rent control will actually force more people out of their homes, right? Like in other words, turn the language on and figure out what is the impact. I'm going to give it a couple examples here in a short order. But so as you approach this, so you think about it, don't be afraid to sort of get to the point of trying to touch into what people, sort of get at a gut level, right? Things that click and make sense to them. All right. And then, so I'm trying to talk both about independent, sort of stuff we do with independent expenditures, as well as sort of issue mobilization, issue advocacy sort of work. So with message to voters, again, it needs to be clear, concise, and demonstrating those shared values. So if you're doing independent expenditures, again, it gets to more about how do we show that this candidate shares the voters' values, right? Sometimes, a lot of times that is through issues, but sometimes it can be illustrative of a story about them that, or who they are as individuals. So, and when I think about, and so I sort of previewed it, when I think about messaging, right, we all often talk about messaging. I think of it more as storytelling. And why is that? Is because stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And they're more memorable. When people remember stories better than they do necessarily facts or figures. This is proven. So when you start to think about how do you, I've thrown all these obstacles, right? There's too much distractions, we too much technical language. So what our goal then is to take all of our information, and the way I would approach it if I was in your shoes and sort of figuring out how to come up with a good message for whatever issue you're dealing with, is you start writing and then you want to break it down. So it's a sentence or two, because people are not spending the time, the people in most of the audiences we're trying to communicate with are not spending the time to sort of decipher everything and thinking about, they're not the subject matter experts by and large that you are, unless you're talking to that top group, right? So anytime you break away from that top group, you have to start thinking about communicating differently. And what I think about with stories is, again, there's a beginning. What is the problem? What is the solution? In a story, it's, what is the conflict, right? So what is and then the end is the resolution, right? And it's usually breaking it down into one or two sentences to sort of give people the arc of, okay, this is the problem, right? Housing is unaffordable in this area, but if we do this, then it'll resolve this, right? So think about, like, when you think about your narrative, sort of a narrative arc, again, problem, solution, and a resolution. And again, sort of going back to what you do with candidates is, when I do these candidate trainings, it's usually to try and figure out to show that that you share their values. Is usually when I was working with candidates, I would use a biographic detail. Like, for example, I worked with a candidate who's now in Congress, who our story about her was, she's a prosecutor mom who will look out for our community, who cares about our community and will defend it, because she was a former prosecutor. I worked for a candidate that was had been a nurse, and in her previous life, and then has been a state senator. And we talked about her as somebody who's always carries these values as a nurse in everything that she does, right? And sort of the mental trick I talk to folks when I talk to candidates about developing their own message, is that you want to think about, like, if you could talk to a voter, right, or anybody that you're trying to activate, if you had 10 seconds to tell them right before they went to vote or right before they, took action, what would you say? Because that's about all the brains, for most of the issues we deal with, and a lot of times unless even for presidential races, there are people that decide to spend less than 5 minutes thinking through, statewide races. So how do you sort of sit through and like really get that message so tight and so clean and so narrow that it's easily understandable, right? And it's concise enough that you could say it in 10 to 20 seconds, and that it sort of makes sense, and it has a beginning, middle, and end, right? So that's a big challenge. It's a sort of a big hill to climb. But that's where ideally you want to be getting to when you're developing and thinking about your message. Okay. So, like I said, I believe in storytelling, right? So I'm going to tell you a quick story. And there's two lines on there that I think to illustrate what I've been talking about in a very quick way. One is, so prior to joining NAR, I like I said, I was a consultant, and I got to work with a local association that represent Henrico County, Virginia. And what they were trying to do was pass a what they refer to as a food tax, right? So a tax on dining out, right? That would raise what people paid, and it would go towards education. Now, this is a pretty swingy area, sort of Democrat, Republican mixed, so forth. And I was working with the association, and we did a poll, and we actually showed that we were down a couple points, but one of the things we noticed was that, and just to give you some background, is that they had tried a few years prior to this to pass it and lost, I think, by 10, 20 points, right? Because it's sort of, a fiscally conservative area. And also there was another food tax that was going on in a county right next door to it that ended up losing by a good 20 points or so forth. So we weren't sure if we could win this, but it was important to the association that they passed this. They wanted to do this for funding for schools. One of the things we did was we did research. Joe Good, the first time I ever talked to Joe Good, American Strategies, was on this campaign, and he had done a poll, and he showed, okay, well, we're down a few points, or we were down, but there was a pathway. And I did notice in talking with Joe that among the African American community in this particular county, we were not as we weren't being supported at the level that you would expect, right, for money going towards education. And part of that issue was, the feeling was, in talking to the folks that in that area, was they sort of felt like, well, there's sort of two sides of the county, and all the money was going, whenever there was more money, there was money that would benefit sort of the white side of the county, or the richer areas, and it wouldn't come to the poor areas, right? And so we're thinking about this, and it's talking about a food tax, right? And so we broke it down and tried to sort of say, okay, how do we make this relatable to the voters, especially those voters that might feel that it is it's not going to help their children, right? But how do you say that without getting into sort of like race politics, right? Because it's clearly the sentiment was there, the feeling was there, but this was it wasn't overt, right? So we came up with this top slogan: for a few pennies more, we can make sure that all of Henrico's children have a brighter future. And a couple of things we're doing here: for a few pennies more, right? So pennies in language is very important whenever you're talking about this, right? And that's why I always advocate for whatever campaigns you do, is test out, do your polling, do your research, figure out, because language matters, right? We're not saying raise the food tax, support the food tax so we can get more money for the schools in Henrico, right? We're very deliberative in what we're saying in this language for a few pennies more, because pennies, like, look, on the average bill, if you dined out in Henrico, it was going to be like a 3 cents per day, 3% raise. So you're going to pay quite a, you could pay a couple dollars every time you went out to eat in Henrico County. But what we framed it was only a few pennies more, right? So we can, right. And it's that very deliberate language. We make sure that all of Henrico's children have a brighter future. Okay. So that worked well. We did a bunch, and so when we illustrated it, when we did all the mail pieces with it, we'd show like a couple pennies on a counter, right, reinforcing it. This is not a huge tax increase or anything that it was just a few pennies, right? And making sure that everything we did with our graphics and our visuals sort of reinforced that it was multicultural, like Black, white, Asia, every child was going to benefit from this, right? So visually, we also showed that as well. Now, one below actually is something I just picked up the other day in talking with the GAD in Wyoming, and I think this one might need a little bit more work, but the issue is in Wyoming, you apparently both commercial and residential property rates are taxed at the same exact rate. By Wyoming Constitution, they have to be, you can't differentiate between commercial and residential. And so their big push is to separate out commercial from residential. So hopefully it will lower the property taxes. It also will allow them to do things like homestead tax exemptions, right? So it's a fairly complex policy in that, it's not something that's intuitively, like, how does that really affect me? Getting back to how does this affect me? And so what the GAD actually said to me, and this is her words, not mine, was grandma shouldn't have to wait on Walmart to get tax relief. Right. So to me, I think that's brilliant because it explains the issue. It makes it relevant, right? And maybe we shouldn't have to, there's probably ways to sort of think through this. But what I like about this is that it takes a very complex problem and breaks it into stuff that is very understandable and relatable. And that's what I think the challenge is a lot of times with our own sort of communication is how do we take that very complex issues and get it to a point where, and we're thinking about grammar, right? And in the one above, we're thinking about the kids. So we're trying to touch into something that people get emotionally, that they understand, right? That it moves it up a level of relevance and importance. Okay. So I know I got covered, but I want to, we got quite a bit to cover through, and hopefully when we get together in person, we'll talk some more about some of this. All right, so now I just want to finish with turning a message into communication materials and sort of best practices. Again, based on some of my career as a consultant. So, look, when I was a direct mail consultant, our firm did what we call eyeball testing, right? And we would look at what do people look at, gave them a bunch of mail and did these electrodes. It was at LSU. It's fascinating information. And over, it was headlines and visuals and graphics and out, right? That was all they looked at. They didn't read all that other language, right? So what does that tell us? That is very important to make sure that the visuals and graphics alone can tell the story. Do they reinforce it? Is the headline clear? And do you have that information? So if you look at a direct mail piece, if you're evaluating, if you get sent direct mail piece or a digital ad, can you take all the words off and get what it says through the visual that they sent you. And reverse wise, do you need the visual to sort of complete the headline? Does the headline make sense? Does it give your message? Do people, in looking at it quickly in 7 to 10 seconds, do they get what you're saying? Does it make it relevant to them? Right. The other thing you want to do, another tip is that it's called chunking of information. So breaking it down into small, digestible universes. People are not reading all the, these paragraphs of information. Even when you're communicating with elected officials, I would urge you to break up, like, your English professor, your English teacher might hate you for this, but you don't need to necessarily keep paragraphs in that sort of format. If you've got something you want to emphasize, break it up into small sentences that people get and understand. The other good thing to do is think about, what are compelling graphics. The other thing we learned from this eyeball testing is whatever the graph is, people look at it and they tend to believe anything with a graph or information on it that seems relevant to them, right? So I don't even know, I didn't even look to see what this graph is telling, but it's natural for people to sort of look for things like this whenever you're doing information. So graphs, anything that catches eyes, whether it's, if you're doing a digital ad, whether you're doing direct mail piece, whether you're doing a memo that you share with as testimony. The other thing I'd say is that citations make things more believable, and I have a lot of fun right there with my own citation. It is true. Like, I think we sometimes miss this, is that whenever in our communication, people are looking for sort of sources of information, and you can so cite your work. And I know it sounds like it's academic, but it makes things more credible, because that's the other thing that, it has to be clear, concise, but also credible. And so especially when you're dealing with issues like this, if we say that this is going to increase, right? If we make an assertion and we have any sort of economic study or anything like that, cite it. Put it in the mail piece as a cite. And I'm going to tell you, the believability, I've seen this in a number of focus groups. If it's cited, they start to attribute certain things to that. So finally, I'm going to end with this. And I obviously intentionally did proofing does matter. I wanted to give you guys a quick checklist of things that when I look at, when I would evaluate whatever campaign material it is, first, is the candidate or candidate's names spelled right? Right, that you could. I have sent mail pieces out, and I will be honest, where there was errors in the text, but as long as you had the name right, is the town, county, state spelled right? Then check, is the social media links accurate? Is the election day correct? And are they listed? Like, if you're dealing with an election, what a common thing to do is not put the election dates on there, right? So you want to give that as information in any sort of communication you do. If you're using a QR code, I highly recommend, honestly, if I was designing mail pieces these days, I would do a headline and a visual, and a QR for more information. I do a QR code. Right. I don't want to overload people with too much information. If they want to go to the QR code and go to your website and find out more information, that's where I would do that. Do the images look like the area? Right. In other words, if we're showing housing, does that look like the housing that's generally in your area? Right. So, like, I live in Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia looks different than Chicago. Northern Virginia looks different than Richmond, Virginia. And anybody with in a quick glance, does that look like the area? Are there recognizable landmarks in the area? Most importantly, do the images reinforce the message? and is information accurate and or defensible. And in political speech, we can make also, like, I will argue that in political speech, you can make assertions and shouldn't be afraid of making assertions as long as you can, in some level, defend that assertion. That is fair game. And then always, I think, put your political hat on. Is there anything individual, like, is there somebody in you've got a photograph that you've captured? Is there a photograph that includes somebody that maybe has endorsed the other candidate that could create a stink, or is like being caught embezzling money, or you never know in some of these images, and that's really on you, is sort of to look at and double check. So I'm throwing a lot at you guys today. I wanted to go through this. Hopefully we'll get a chance to discuss this for those that are coming to in person a little bit more. I think there's a real skill to political communication. It takes a lot of work. Some of this is very common sense, but I also want to make sure that you sort of think through this as you sort of help develop, because part of your role you'll be asked, especially working with consultants, for guidance, or you're going to be evaluating information as they sort of develop those things, and how do you sort of take a look at those things. So throwing a lot at you, but I appreciate your time. Happy Friday to you. Happy Labor Day weekend. And we'll be back next week. John McCloskey will be leading us through some legal best practices, talking through that. And then the following week after that, we will be talking with calls for action. And then hopefully a week after that, I'll be seeing a number of you in person. Thank you and take care.